Hello and welcome to the first ever Kenosha Public Library podcast. Cruising through history with Scott Cruz. I'm Zander Miller. Scott, what are we cruising through today?
Well, thank you, Zander, for the introduction. Today I'm going to talk about Abraham Lincoln as a wrestler.
What?
Yes, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's when he was a young man, he was actually a very good wrestler. And one of his matches have actually come down to us from several eyewitness accounts. And it does have a bearing on his career.
Seriously, like wrestling has a bearing on Abraham Lincoln's career.
Yes, it does.
Are we talking in the wrestling ring, like gonna grab each other, throw each other down, and pin them wrestling?
I probably should start by saying that we're not thinking of someone in a sequin jumpsuit hitting someone over with the head with a chair. What we're thinking of is wrestling as we know it now, like you'd see in the Olympics or something. So it would start with a hold. In fact, they said in this match that they both started from a side hold, which people have always interpreted different ways. There was a difference in the West, and in those days, Illinois was considered the West, between wrestling and what was called scuffling. And
what's the difference there?
Well, wrestling was more of a hold. You sometimes had to have agility and speed and things of that nature, where scuffling was just all and out fighting. So eye gouging was actually a very big thing in scuffling, and you could do anything in scuffling basically. So, but when Lincoln, I think people think Lincoln was born in Illinois, but he was actually born in Kentucky. And then he lived in Indiana, and then his family moved to Illinois in 1830. So he went to New Salem in 1831. And in that area, there was actually several what you would call gangs, not gangs as we would think of them, but think of like the movie The Gangs of New York.
Okay.
So, and the highest, the best gang was the Clary Groves Boys gang. And they were out of Clary's Grove, which was outside of New Salem. And these guys were really something. Of course, they drank a lot. They destroyed stores. They would put people in barrels and kick them down the hill. So
you're telling me that not only was Lincoln in wrestling, but he was also part of a gang.
No, I'm sorry.
I was about to say.
He wasn't part of a gang, but in the West, the wrestling was very popular. And they would also sometimes sort of goad new people into seeing, it's sort of like an initiation rite.
Okay.
And Lincoln was known for his strength. And in fact, he was known for his strength even before this. He had worked in a dry goods store owned by a man named Dennis Offutt. And Offutt, when he saw how strong Lincoln was, he kind of put out a challenge to the community that he would give $10 to anybody who could beat Lincoln. Now Lincoln really wasn't the one who was doing this, but so this $10 challenge went out. The Clary's Grove Boys accepted it, and they put up their number one man against Lincoln, a man named Jack Armstrong.
Okay.
And so the match happened, and there was some speculation on what exactly happened. Apparently it was a draw. Armstrong had committed a foul.
Oh, okay.
During it.
Not Honest Abe, though. Not
Honest Abe.
We'll give it a foul there.
But funny enough, one of the eyewitnesses, and we don't know if this is true or not, but they had said that Lincoln was so enraged by this foul that he grabbed Armstrong by the throat and picked him up.
No way.
Yes, and because Lincoln was very strong. We see Lincoln in the Civil War, we see those pictures, and they're almost Shakespearean, and he just looks so careworn.
Yeah, he looks like tired. He looks like this tall, lanky guy. That's what it seemed what he looks like, right?
Yes, and so we never really think of Lincoln as a youth, which he was, and he was raised on a farm, and he did a lot of farm work, and he hated physical labor. That's why he read so much. And his father used to rent him out to other farmers to do labor for them. And so I guess it's where he learned to split rails so well, because he did actually. I know he always hated that whole rail splitter image, but that's how it came about.
So let me get this right.
Okay.
This guy, this Abraham Lincoln guy, he's the tall, skinny dude.
Right.
He didn't like physical labor.
Right.
But he ends up on the farms. He ends up being known for his strength and splitting rails.
Right.
And then he got challenged for wrestling because this guy was bragging about how strong Lincoln was.
Yes.
And rumored, allegedly, picked up the dude, one hand or two hands.
They said one hand. Well, and they also said Lincoln used to be able to pick up things with one hand that other people couldn't, and I think that was because he was so tall. And in those days, people weren't tall.
Yeah.
So I think he also stood out. He was gangly a little bit. He's somebody wore pants that were too short, and his ankles would show when he'd ride a horse. And people have sort of these funny stories about him, but he always impressed people, not just with his strength, but with his intellect. And I think even when he went to New Salem before this started happening, he started acquiring friends. He was totally alone when he went to New Salem. His family had moved to Coles County, and then Lincoln went his own way. So when he got to New Salem, he didn't really know anybody, and that's when he met Joshua Speed, which was one of his lifelong friends. So for him to go and he was already garnering some kind of a reputation. And then when this event happened, which people can't seem to agree on exactly how it ended, but they do all agree it happened, and it was a draw.
Okay.
So we don't know about him lifting up. That might just be, and for a long time, I think people thought it was sort of mythological because
I was about to say it sounds like Lincoln mythos, because it sounds like ancient, like Greek mythology and all those
Yes.
legendary people. This is like Lincoln. This is almost like that movie Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer. Like it's
Yes.
that sort of mythos. Like this dude is lifting people up and wrestling, but that's what we're going for here. Like he's
right.
It's mythology.
Right, and actually, there's a similar mythology about Daniel Boone. Mm-hmm. Wherein he wrestled an enemy, if you will, but then, once he beat him, they became fast friends, and this guy actually would help him, and so there was always that too. But I think a lot of because there's so many people that wrote about this particular match, and actually, to be honest with you, Lincoln wasn't the only wrestler in his family.
Wow. I'm just imagining a bunch of tall Lincolns, all like bare-chested wrestling, Olympic style.
Right, and in fact, his uncle Mordecai was known as a wrestler, and his mother, Nancy Hanks, was.
His mother.
Yes.
What time period are we talking here?
This would have been the early 1800s, most likely. Now, the problem with his mother's is that he wasn't. That's never been verified.
Okay.
They thought now Lincoln had two mothers, but his first mother, Nancy Hanks, died when Lincoln was, I think, 10 years old or so, and she was the one that was sort of known to throw a man if he if he got in her way or something. But some of this stuff just takes on it gets a little out there sometimes. But the thing with, and so the Armstrong match, we know that happened.
Yeah.
So that one we do know. And what happened was, because he had bested, in everyone's mind, that he had bested Jack Armstrong, they became friends. Now, the reason this is important is because in the Clary's Grove boys were what you might call a gang, but they were also able to support people politically. Because they could get out the vote, or they could do other things. Mm-hmm. And this kind of foreshadows what Lincoln will experience in 1860, when the Republicans have what are called the Wide Awakes, which were a group of young men, and basically these were mostly men, and they would have torch parades and stuff like that to support their candidates. And the Boyos, which were in another gang, that was New York City. And so, and what he did is, I think it was almost establishing sort of leadership in the community.
wrestling or the gangs themselves?
Because he had won, he wasn't part of a gang, but he sort of stood out then.
So it would be the equivalent of having street cred.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you're saying Lincoln had street cred because he was wrestling, all because he was just strong, and this guy was like, you know what, I'll put $10 on it.
Yeah. So no one, and the funny thing is, I don't think anybody won the $10 because it was a draw. So Offutt and Dennis Offutt, who later absconded from New Salem full of debt, so he never had to pay the $10 anyway.
Fair.
So, yeah, it's very interesting that, I ran across this. I've read so many books on Lincoln, and they all talk about this thing. It just, not pages and pages. One of the best I've read was Honor's Voice by Douglas Wilson. That has a whole first chapter devoted. It's actually, the chapter is called Wrestling with the Evidence. And so, and some people think, John Todd Stewart, who was Lincoln's cousin through marriage to Mary Todd, he's the one who started this. So in 1860, in a campaign biography, he had mentioned this, and he had called it the turning point in Lincoln's life. Now, I think he did it because that established him in New Salem. And later that year, in 1832, in the Black Hawk War, Lincoln was nominated to become captain of the militia by the Clary's Grove boys, mostly because they were in the militia as well. So he was seen as a leader even then. And he would always joke about his Black Hawk War. It's the only time he was ever in what you would call the military.
So, and this is something I don't really, when I think of Lincoln, I don't see a military man. You think George Washington, you see him in the military uniform. You don't really see necessarily, the presidential figure. But Lincoln here, this is like his only hit into this sort of military thing,
Right.
all because of a wrestling match.
Yes, in a lot of ways. Because they saw him as really a plus his intellectual, even then he had intellectual gifts that other people just didn't have, and people saw that. But I do think it's because of that. I mean, I think it established him in some ways. And so, but you're right about Lincoln. He wasn't much of a military. In fact, he'd always make jokes about, they would do battle with the mosquitoes, or they would they liberated an onion field or something, because they didn't really do much. In the Black Hawk War, I think they marched north into even what would be present-day Wisconsin. The militia did, or even Illinois, northern Illinois, and they didn't really have much action up there.
Yeah,
so,
no.
But it really is his only foray into the military. And then in 1834, 2 years later, he was elected to the state legislature. Mm-hmm. And he had his law practice too. So I think some people thought this was what started that train rolling. And I guess people would say, well, if wrestling was such a big sport in the West, which it was because it was a very masculine culture, mm-hmm. So what? Everyone wrestled. I said, yeah, but not everyone became president of the United States either from that region. And I think that's why it has, because I think it just has that sort of, it's sort of forgotten. Lincoln scholars know it, but we always know Lincoln as an older man, and it's true for any president. Mm-hmm. We don't know much about the youth of Millard Fillmore, for example.
Yeah, we don't really hear much about we're like the presidential years, and then we stop. I think probably Barack
yes.
is probably one of the few that we may know more, partly because he was so young when he became president.
Right, and the interesting thing about Barack Obama is that people remember when he announced for the presidency in 2008, I believe, mm-hmm. he did it in Springfield, Illinois, because, of course, he was making the connection to Lincoln.
Oh, okay.
And so I think he did it at that time, yeah.
So I'm gonna go a stretch here. I'm gonna go a big stretch here.
All right, stretch away.
Would you say that because Lincoln got his start with wrestling, become president, and Barack went back to Springfield to connect with Lincoln's presidency, right. Would you say that former President Barack Obama's presidency was in part a result of Lincoln winning a wrestling match?
Well, that's a great question, because of course, all the historical events that followed, mm-hmm. and you go up the line, and when Lincoln became president, and he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And I don't know if I'd go maybe that far, but
It's a few hundred years.
I know
something years.
it's fun to speculate.
Yeah.
But I think those, you're going in that line, and so because and Lincoln, even when he became president, he didn't have a lot of political experience either in the sense of serving. He was in the state legislature in Illinois. He served one term in the House of Representatives in Washington, and that was it. It was his actions during the 1850s that caught people's attention. From his 1854, when Stephen Douglas became his nemesis because of the whole Kansas-Nebraska Act, and so he got back into politics. He was actually just practicing law for most of that time.
Yeah.
So
Were there any other like wrestling matches that Lincoln was into, or was he challenged to anything else?
well, it's funny because I saw something. I was looking up something, and someone said, he had 300 wrestling matches. I'm thinking, there's no way we can even. But in the Black Hawk War, he had one. In fact, he was up talking or doing something, and a scuffle had broken out in the ranks, if you will, and he jumped off his log or whatever he was talking on and ran over and broke the thing up.
No way.
Yes, he did.
There's so he.
No wonder he is such a great vampire hunter.
Right? I'm starting to think he's like, maybe that movie had a point. There's a little historical.
Well, he was running around that
there.
movie with an axe, so he could hoist it.
So it seems like Lincoln has it all. He's got the physical strength, and a lot of this it just comes down to like he got clout. That's the real kicker here is he got clout from this physical activity, this man's game, this wrestling. And,
Which is funny because he was sort of opposite that. He was very, and I think he wanted to be more known for his thinking than for anything else.
But he had both.
He had both.
So that wow, there's just I'm gonna go back to Barack Obama again because when I think of like clout that he had, it's like he played basketball with people a lot. Like that was one of the things he was known for is just he'll go play basketball on a campaign trail with like a group of people. And it's kind of like Lincoln's wrestling here is like the thing that got people, the physical thing, the connection he made was through, his wrestling and his ability to like, not scuffle, but just,
Well, there's even a story
down.
that when he was nominated for the presidency in 1860, he was actually out playing baseball in a field and someone ran out and told him because in those days the candidate didn't go to the to the convention because they didn't want to make it look like they wanted it. They sort of had to be asked about it, which we're really a long way from that today. So
quite a bit.
Right. So it is interesting that he was able to make these connections. I think that's what it kind of comes down to. That yes, he wrestled and he beat this guy, or it was a draw, but he made all these connections in the community, and people saw this and. People who could help him. John Todd Stewart was one. A man named Bowling Green was another one. And so he had all these people and people were willing to help him because they saw something in him. Now, we don't know Lincoln. There's no film of him. We don't know how he sounded. I know the Steven Spielberg movie. I think with Daniel Day-Lewis, I think that's probably as close as we're going to get. Because even Lewis tried to walk like him, because they always said he had this gait. And he would always say chairman. He always spoke through kind of nasally because he still had this sort of Southern accent.
Yeah.
But man, when you see some of his writings and you try to put them all together, it doesn't. Sometimes you go, this guy wrote this. You think of the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural. So yeah, it's interesting. I think it was more about the connections that were made, if anything, than just a wrestling match. And I think that's why a lot of people thought it became a big deal in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack Armstrong actually supported Lincoln most of his life. And they were able to, in Illinois, to get these political groups together. And I don't know if I guess if you cross the Clary Grove boys, they might throw you down a hill in a barrel. So that might encourage people. So, but yeah, it's an interesting byway, I guess, from Lincoln's life, which, I don't want to torture the road analogy too much, but it's kind of, here it is, and then it goes off in another direction. Because Lincoln could have went to New Salem and failed.
Yeah.
In fact, he was working in another store where, again, the owner absconded. and Lincoln was part owner of the store. So Lincoln was left with this debt that it took him to like 1848 to pay off, but he paid off the whole thing.
Yeah.
And there's all the stories about Honest Abe, and some of them are just myth. But the story about like him walking 6 miles to a guy's farm to borrow Euclid, and then bringing it back when he was done, that's a real story.
Yeah.
It was hard to get those, and him and his father clashed all the time because his father didn't see what was the point of all these books, which I guess is sort of an age-old story of sons clashing with their fathers. And so him and his father had a strained relationship, I think, well, they did. I mean, there's no I think. So.
It's not because they wrestled and Abe won and he was like,
No.
Dad was embarrassed about it. Not because of that.
No, I could just imagine Thomas Lincoln wrestling. The mental image is kind of funny. But Thomas Lincoln wasn't tall. Most of the family members agreed that Abe got most of his traits from his mother.
The one that was throwing people.
Yes.
Like, that would throw people. Okay,
and
that makes sense.
He got those from his mother, the strength, the height. Thomas Lincoln was kind of a small man, and he got on better with his stepchildren later in life than Abraham himself. And Lincoln's like anybody. He's complicated, and I know that because when you read enough of it, it's like, well, why do you do that or why do you do that? Well, human beings are human beings, and but he also had compassion in him too.
Yeah.
Even during the Civil War, I mean, I don't know how even during things that would happen then, and I mean, you see it in the photos. It's almost like you almost feel kind of bad for him because he just looks so careworn, and I think he was in a lot of ways.
So I have to ask this. Okay.
Okay.
I have to.
You have to.
So you get
ask away.
Put Abe Lincoln in the ring. Okay.
Okay.
Just imagine this
in his sequined jumpsuit.
Yeah, sequined jumpsuit. All
with
the
his
works.
tall hat. I can just see the stovepipe hat with the jumpsuit.
All right.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
Pair him against any other U.S. president. All right, anybody. Who's got the best chance of beating Abe Lincoln in a wrestling match?
Washington.
Really?
I think.
Okay.
Or Jefferson even. I think more Washington. The thing about both of them, I think of all the 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore, I think they could all fight each other, without sounding too ridiculous. Because Theodore Roosevelt was also, he was a boxer though. And so.
Wait, but we're wrestling.
I know.
Okay.
I would say Washington because they were both pretty big guys. Washington was another one for the time period who was very tall and broad-shouldered and everything else.
And military experience.
He was another one who could pick up barrels, and lug them around and impress people with that. And now Jefferson, he was also a larger man for that time, but I don't know if he had that sort of rough and tumble in him. And so, but can you imagine Washington versus Lincoln? That'd be something.
I'm pretty sure there's a rap battle somewhere in there. I'm pretty sure one exists.
I just think you wouldn't get Millard Fillmore versus Lincoln or. And I was actually ran this question by one of my coworkers just as see what they thought, and she said, "What about Andrew Jackson?" I said, "Well, Andrew Jackson was a smaller guy, but he was very feisty, as we sort of know."
Yeah, I was thinking, weren't there a few presidents that fended off some assassin? I forgot which ones fended off.
Well, Jackson had 3 bullets in him.
Yeah.
He had gotten into I'm picturing this because we don't usually think this. So he had gotten into a shooting match with I can't remember who. In Nashville, they were in a hotel, and he actually was hit. But they couldn't get the ball out, so they just left it in there. So for his whole life, he carried this around with him. And he had been in some duels, and, dueling was sort of going away by that time, but, he'd been in gunfights.
But that's different from physical prowess, though. That's
right, that's why I think if you had, man to man or whatever you want to call it. Mano a mano. You had Washington and Lincoln. I think there's your match.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. I'm going through all the presidents in my head right now.
I'm trying to think of modern presidents. I'm like,
sort of
no,
up to-
no.
Yeah, William Howard Taft was a big guy, but not in like a strong way.
Yeah, kind of same
was
with
just-
Trump there too. Like he's a big guy, but Trump's also a lot older.
Right.
So
Right, and I think that's another thing we forget, that when Lincoln died, he was only 56.
yeah,
He looked
Lincoln was
so
young.
much older than he looked so much older in those photos
Mm-hmm.
that you think 56, yeah, that's all he was. And so, but yeah, it's just I'm still mulling over that question about who could take him. And William Howard Taft, like I said, was a big guy, but he wasn't really strong. Maybe Grover Cleveland. No, I'm still thinking.
So wait, let's think. I'm thinking of the results here. So going for especially late presidents. So latest president, not including Biden, dude's old. He is old. So let's go starting with Trump. Trump loses, right?
Probably.
Okay. Barack, too skinny, like too lanky.
Yeah,
He's gonna lose there.
probably.
Okay. Then we had before that
George
we had Bush, young Bush.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think he'd lose. To
Okay. Clinton,
I don't think so.
older Bush.
No.
you just laughed about that one. All right.
Ronald Reagan, no.
No, yeah, I was about to say Reagan. No.
Now, Lyndon Johnson is interesting. I know we skipped over Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon,
But they get tossed, right?
probably.
Okay.
But I think Lyndon Johnson, he was a big man too.
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind of a braggadocio. He of course, he was from Texas. That's another, his family were some of the original, they were one of the original settlers of Texas too.
You don't mess with Texas, even.
Right. So he had a different attitude to those kind of things. But I don't know. I'd still say no. I just can't see that happening.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, Lincoln's. Dang. I'm thinking about it. I'm just thinking it's like, wow, who would Lincoln has so much to his name now that I'm thinking about it. He's got so much.
And
there.
you just think, and whenever you think there can't be anything more to be said about Lincoln, something always comes up because people are always studying him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a new book out by a man named Michael Burlingame about Lincoln's marriage, which could be a whole podcast in itself, because I guess his marriage was not great. I mean, but Mary Todd has been sort of vilified through the years, but then more feminist authors have sort of redeemed her in the last 30 or 40 years to say, listen, there was a reason that she was the way she was. And Lincoln wasn't, sometimes he was emotionally unavailable. He could be very sullen. He would go into depressions. That's another thing, Lincoln's depressions. There's actually a book called Lincoln's Depression or something. I can't remember. And so you see that a very complicated person, and sometimes just kind of a sad story in some ways because he had so much loss in his life, and
Yeah.
I think that affected him.
Wow.
I believe. But the wrestling match, and just to sort of sum up the whole thing with Jack Armstrong and how it still led to something else, was in 1857 Jack Armstrong died, and later that year his son Duff Armstrong was accused of murder. So Armstrong's widow had contacted Lincoln and said, "Can you defend my son?" He said gladly, because he had known Duff Armstrong his whole life. And so during the trial, one of the witnesses said, well, I witnessed Duff Armstrong run out of the field after he did this, or I witnessed him do this, because there was a full moon. Okay. So Lincoln, very dramatically, he gets an almanac, Farmer's Almanac or something, and he says, well, I have here that on that day, there was no full moon, it was cloudy, and you wouldn't have been able to see him, because remember, there's no lights.
Yeah.
There's no like city lights, so you need a full moon to actually see somebody in the dark. And it became known as the Almanac Trial, and it became another famous,
Oh my gosh.
sort of another famous thing in Lincoln's life, even before he ran for president. So it's funny how that one event, how that even tied into something like that, because that's, he knew Armstrong, he was willing to do this, and sometimes he'd do a lot of his work pro bono too for people, or he just wouldn't charge them. It used to drive his law partner Herndon crazy because they were, he would just keep bills in his hat, and if they got lost, he didn't care. They get lost.
Yeah.
So it's funny. I know in some ways it seems, well, that was just a wrestling match, but it's like, yeah, but it led to so many other things for him, and it really established him with people, and he became a leader in the community, and I think that's where he went. And then New Salem was kind of died, and so that's when he ended up in Springfield, Illinois. And then it just took off from there.
Wow, Lincoln's incredible, man.
So, he is. There's always something to know about Lincoln or read about Lincoln, and trust me, there's enough books.
So Scott,
yes,
you have any preview of what we might talk about next time?
Next time we are going to talk about how the use of mustard gas led to chemotherapy treatments.
Okay, I'll look forward to that one. All right, well, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining. We'll hope to see you soon, or hear you soon on the next KPL broadcast.
Yes, thank you.